most emotions start in the gut, like as a sensation. And then they move up to like our heart space where there's more emotion. And then it moves up to our throat space where we express it. And if we can stay present in each one of those steps, then our emotions actually get released as opposed to like cycled. And I think a lot of us, and part of it's just being human, but we get stuck in these same cycles. And to me, it means like the emotions aren't completing. They're just getting stored.
Howdy, everyone. It's your host, Polly Siegel. And for anyone who doesn't know me, I'm a licensed clinical social worker, certified addiction specialist, and master level trained mindfulness practitioner. I own a counseling practice in both Colorado and Illinois, and I specialize in trauma, OCD, and anxiety. If you live in either of those two states, feel free to reach out to me for a consultation, and we can begin the therapeutic journey together. Now on to the good shit. Welcome to season 3 of Shit Talkin' Shrinks. Gosh, I'm so excited. I will be featuring experts in the healing space, and we're discussing a variety of mental health topics, the human experience, and society at large, while creating levity along the way. Get ready to laugh, learn a lot, and change your life for good. Hello, everyone. I have a very, very, very special guest today that I've been following your work for a while. So I'm having a little what do they call it? Starstruck, where I'm like, oh, you get to be here with me today? I'm fucking stoked. So we have Erika Straub here today, and she specializes in IFS and polyvagal theory and nervous system regulation, really helping women in particular work through, chronic anxiety states. But both of us have really agreed that this episode, we want to make this where it doesn't feel like it's only applicable to women. We want this to be something that can be applied to all genders and identification. And our topic today is anxiety, but also how to create a more internal, safe, and secure experience. Because Erika, wouldn't you say that when you're chronically anxious, you don't really feel internally safe?
You feel the complete opposite of safe. Like the alarm bells are ringing, you're in an existential crisis, you're not present. To me, it's the complete opposite of safety and security.
Yeah. And what does it mean to be chronically anxious? Like if someone wonders, is that me? How would you define it?
Let me think back to an old version of myself or a part of myself. When I think about being chronically anxious, there's no ease in my body. Like somatically, sensation-wise, I'm just in a lot of tension. And kind of like in a shell, hard, rigid. You can actually just see it in how people move their body. Is someone really tense and rigid? Like that tells a story right there. So I think if we start with the body, that's what it looks and feels like. And then if we look at the thought process, it's really the thoughts are racing. We're thinking about worst case scenarios. We are overthinking, over preparing, overwhelmed. And to me, it's like I just can't sink into this moment. I can't actually connect with myself or anyone around me because I'm just scared and worried that something bad is going to happen.
So for you, you see it very much so as a mind-body duo.
Absolutely. Yeah. And a lot of times, though, when we're in that state, we're so out of body. Like if you asked me 5 to 10 years ago, kind of how I was existing in the world, I was so unaware of my body. That wasn't even on my radar. I was living completely in my head.
Yeah. I think that's a really important point. And I see that clinically in my practice where there's a lot of cognitions going on and the brain is telling a lot of stories and narratives. And then when I'm like, okay, what are you noticing in your body? It's like this disconnect of like, what do you mean?
Yeah, it's like I have a body. There's a body. There's something happening below my head. What? Yeah, I had no idea. I actually remember the moment when I first really connected with my body. I was in a yoga class, no idea what pose I was doing, but all of a sudden my breath and my nervous system were really connecting my mind and my body. And there was just this moment of like peace and quiet. And I just bawled. I just ugly cried, bawled, collapsed on the ground because it was like, wow, like that's the place I want to live from. And I have lived so far from that place.
Yeah. I have a very similar story where I was in a chronic state of, hyper arousal, where I was just like cheetah mode 24/7. And all I could think about is what did I need to do and how I'm going to do it and when it's going to get done and why it's important. And my body was screaming at me for a decade.
I can relate. It was absolutely at least a decade. And it's just so interesting when we're like out of body. Our body is still trying to communicate with us. Like I was having terrible digestive problems, getting sick all the time, not sleeping, like all of these different signs were coming from my body being like, hey, I think you need to like come back to your body and actually feel what's going on here.
Yeah, I'm really glad you just mentioned the medical part of things because people a lot of times don't see the connection between mental health and physical health. And there's a huge connection. And as you said, like my IBS was out of control. My skin was like really inflamed, lots of cystic acne. I was constantly getting colds. I'd get roughly 4 to 5 colds a year, which is not common. I've asked doctors and they're like, on average, people get 2 colds a year, if that. And it was just so interesting that my body was screaming for attention, yet it was so hard for me to pay attention and honor it. Do you find that that's an experience with chronic anxiety, is the inability to honor what's happening in the body?
Yeah, I think there's just like too much noise and it really feels like we need to outward focus instead of internal focus. When all of this was happening for me, I was looking externally for all the answers, for things to make me feel better, whether it was other people, whether it was food, whether it was over exercising. Like that's when I really turned outward. And I think we do that because it feels so terribly uncomfortable inside. Like what's happening is really scary, to be quite honest. And for me, it wasn't until I really like hit capacity and burnout and anxiety attacks that it was like, I need to actually slow down and start to face myself and face all of these different things coming up because these band-aids are not working. I'm in this never ending cycle and loop. I'm repeating patterns and it's just getting worse. So it really sat me down where I had to get still and actually listen. But I fought it. I did not want to.
Because it is terribly painful and it's daunting and it's very scary to be present with the yuck because no one taught us how. There was not one course or class or anything that told us how to be in our bodies, how to regulate our nervous system, and how to be able to move through the discomfort of life. We're not taught. So how could we?
Yeah. My unconscious like rule I had was don't feel anything. So I was just in my head intellectualizing, being trying to be rational, logical, reasonable. That was just the space I lived in so that I didn't have to feel. Like that was my code that I was going to live by. Do not feel. Whatever you have to do to not feel, do that. And turns out that is literally the recipe for anxiety. Like to me, anxiety is just like all of these unfelt and unresolved emotions that we just don't know how to sit with and be with and alchemize and talk about and feel.
Wow. So I think that is so interesting because when we think about anxiety, we think of it as a singular emotional experience. But if I'm reading between the lines, it's a plethora of other emotions, maybe like shame, guilt, loneliness, rejection, stress, that's really behind it and it fuels the anxiety.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's really three primary emotions that make up anxiety. One of them is grief. I know for me, until I was actually able to grieve, I did not make any dents in anxiety until I could actually like liquefy my emotions and soften. And, grief is like a tsunami, it just shakes everything loose. So until I could actually grieve, anxiety did not change. And then I think the second part is rage. I know specifically for women, this is for everyone, but specifically for women, we're taught to be so nice and good and polite, and we get so disconnected from our anger and our rage. And to me, if we don't own that, we're staying in this anxious state. Like our voice has to break through that anxiety. And then the last piece I think anxiety is made up of is shame. And I ask my clients that I work with, I know this was a huge part of my journey, but if you didn't fear being unlovable, would you be so anxious?
Hmm.
And so if we weren't afraid of like not being lovable, which is shame, we probably wouldn't be so anxious.
I'm just sitting with what you're saying because I think it's incredibly powerful. And I would almost add, and I don't know if this is what you see, but also like if I wasn't so afraid to be unworthy, because I find unworthiness and unlovability goes hand in hand.
Yeah. Yeah. I would agree with that for sure. When we're in an anxious state, we're really disconnected from our worth.
Can we go back to grief? Because that one is interesting. I think we classically think of grief as we've lost somebody that's very important and special to us. When you say you need to address the grief, what does that really mean?
For me, grief started when I did lose someone. I lost my father in my early 20s, and that's when I actually started having anxiety, or at least aware of it. That's when I started having panic attacks when I lost someone, but I wasn't able to grieve. Like I was absolutely trying to hold it all together. And that's what really contributed to immense amount of grief. But to me, grief shows up in so many places. It's every decision we make, we're basically having to let go of another pathway or another possibility. Like every single decision we make, there's something we might be gaining, but there's also something we could be losing. So grief can show up in like the most micro moments to these big moments of losing someone, and whether it's death, the end of a relationship, loss in any capacity is obviously the biggest trigger for grief. But I don't think a lot of us know how to actually grieve, or we don't feel safe enough to go there.
Yeah. And by expanding the definition of grief to just be any loss, that opens up for so much more opportunity to evaluate your life and see really where the losses have taken place. Like it could be loss of a friend.
Yeah.
Right. Grieving old friendships that have evolved in ways that aren't still what you always imagined them to be.
Yeah, yeah. And I think of grief too when we're referencing like the loss of someone or the loss of a job or a chapter or something that really was significant to us or we felt a lot of love for. Grief is basically like I have all this love for someone or something, but now nowhere to put it. Grief is love without a home.
Grief is love without a home. So by finding a home, does that begin to heal grief?
Yeah, I think that's what this whole self-development journey is about, is how do I create a home within myself? We find homes in other people or jobs or passions, but do we have a home within ourselves?
And then I know the second pillar was rage. And that probably coincides with anger and resentment and that cluster. But you're right. Anger is I find that it's a pendulum. Either people are super connected to anger and they just naturally orient themselves to the world through that emotion, or there's fear around it and it's avoided like the plague. And I happen to fall into the latter category where I try so hard not to feel angry. Anger feels very unsafe in my body, and I judge myself when I feel anger.
I think anger is really misunderstood. Like either we're in repression or passive aggressiveness, right? Where we won't touch it, won't feel it, we avoid it, or we're in rage, which is not anger. Like both of them to me are forms of dissociating from anger. One of them's like, I'm not willing to go there. And the other one's like, I need to get this out of my body so fast because I can't tolerate it. But to me, anger is like really sitting in that burn, that fire, and letting it alchemize, but finding your voice in it. So it's not rage. It's not putting another person down. It's not violent. But anger is basically saying, I matter and I'm here and I'm going to advocate for myself.
Right. And I tell clients all the time, you know, and I disclose that like I can relate your desire to want to avoid anger or minimize it or diminish it. I can feel that. And anger is a protective emotion. Evolutionarily, it's kept us safe. And I think we view anger as the big bad wolf, when in fact it's actually here to help us remain safe, help us advocate, help us stand up for ourselves, and help us create boundaries if necessary.
Yeah, I totally agree. I don't think we can actually feel safe if we can't connect to our anger. If we can't connect to our anger, then we create all of these defenses. We become really defensive. If we can't be anger or communicate it directly, we end up just being very defensive. And I can very much relate to that. As on my journey, I've been really kind of dismantling different defensive strategies that I've had that have kept people at a distance.
Yeah. You use the word alchemize. I know that there are probably hundreds of people that are like, what the fuck does that mean? So let's go there.
Okay. Well, when I think of alchemy in the sense of like the emotional response cycle, what I mean is that we are not blocked in that cycle, that if we have an emotion, it moves through us, gets expressed and resolved. So I think of it as most emotions start in the gut, like as a sensation. And then they move up to like our heart space where there's more emotion. And then it moves up to our throat space where we express it. And if we can stay present in each one of those steps, then our emotions actually get released as opposed to like cycled. And I think a lot of us, and part of it's just being human, but we get stuck in these same cycles. And to me, it means like the emotions aren't completing. They're just getting stored.
And how would one know if an emotion is being stored? What are the telltale signs?
Anxiety.
Anxiety. Okay.
Anxiety. or on the other end of the spectrum, depression.
Okay. So if someone is in a chronic state, a chronic depressive state or chronically anxious, that might be a window to go, what emotions are not resolved within you?
Yeah. And when I think about like the anxious presentation and the depressed presentation, most of the time depression is because we're suppressing so much, right? Like we're flatlining, we're pushing it down. And a lot of times with anxiousness, we're just pushing it out. We're just spilling out. We're just dumping everything out. Either in both cases, we're not sitting with it, feeling it and communicating from like a vulnerable place. So each one, isn't alchemizing emotions.
Right. No, that makes total sense. And then the last pillar was shame. So with that, how do you find that it typically manifests?
Yeah, when I think of shame, I think of what are the ways that I show up when I don't feel good enough? What are the ways I show up when I really want to be liked? What are the things I do to not let people like really see who I am? And those are all shame-based behaviors. And usually it comes down to kind of this bucket of people pleasing, being a perfectionist, performing and always being on, and pretending. And I think for me, one of the biggest ones was pretending like, I'm fine. I'm okay. I'm fine. I don't need anything. I'm good. And I think we each have maybe like a dominant one in that bucket that we go to when we really don't want to be seen or don't know how to let people see us because it feels so shameful when they see these like tender parts of us that we want to hide or we want to get rid of or we want to just be normal. So I think shame shows up more often than people think.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's pervasive.
Yeah.
And I think Brene Brown did such a beautiful job of bringing shame and her research to the average Joe.
She did.
And I think it's allowed for people to orient to this concept of, not believing that you inherently deserve love and not believing that you inherently belong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I don't think there's anything more painful than feeling like you don't belong.
Right. Right.
Whether it's like with yourself, other people in a relationship, in community, I don't think there's anything more painful than like sitting in that void of I don't belong.
Absolutely. And I would even add an evolutionary lens to that like we survived when we had community and we had a tribe. So that of course brings up a feeling of I'm not safe, I'm not secure, I'm not okay. Because when we don't feel connected, that could be life-threatening, or at least that's how the brain views it.
Yeah. And it is life-threatening when we're so young. So if we didn't have that sense of like belonging or attachment, secure attachment with our mother, especially, but both caretakers, that was life-threatening. And so I think that gets triggered present day, right? When we don't feel connected or we don't feel like we belong, it triggers that really young experience. And it does feel life-threatening.
I want to take a quick pause to talk about our sponsor, a company called BetterHelp. It's an online therapy platform where all the therapists are licensed and accredited professionals. It's affordable. You pay a low flat fee for therapy with your therapist, and it's convenient. Do it at your own time and at your own pace, and you can communicate with your therapist as much as you want and whenever you feel is needed. And more importantly, it's effective. Thousands of people have benefited from therapy using BetterHelp, and we're really grateful to offer all of our listeners 10% off your first month. So if you're interested in receiving therapy ASAP, click the link in our show notes and you can get started. And you get to save money. If someone is resonating with our messaging today, well, I think how could they not? This is like such an amazing conversation. It truly is. And they wanted to start to explore their internal shame, rage, or grief. How do you begin that process?
Oof, such a good question. I think that there's different entryways depending on different people. I know for me, like my entry into kind of coming back into my body and actually starting to feel my emotions was movement, was exercise, was yoga, like having a really like body-based practice and not so much geared towards aesthetics or any goals like that, but actually moving my body because that helped me connect more. I think some people might gravitate towards going to therapy or talking to someone and starting from a more cognitive, intellectual place. So I think you can start in either direction, but what has to be there is you getting really honest with yourself. We have to really start getting honest with ourselves, and it can be something as simple as, I'm not happy right now. My career isn't fulfilling, or my relationship isn't safe, right? Like whatever that like raw truth is, I think we got to get really honest with ourselves.
Well, and I think a lot of people, when they're in a chronic state of hypervigilance or, hypoarousal, hyperarousal, are those trauma states, it's very hard to even know what safety means. Like if you would have asked me 10 years ago, Paulina, what does it mean or look like to feel safe? I would look at you, as if you had horns. Like I would have no idea what the fuck that meant. So what is, as we move through this together, for me, safety is connectedness. Safety is being able to be in my body and tolerate whatever the inner world looks like in that moment. Safety is having inner resiliency to know that things are temporary, right? Like these states are temporary and they will not haunt me forever. and that that by tolerating them and opening and expanding to them, you inherently will move through them. To me, that's safety, but I'm sure you have more to add.
No, I think that's a great definition. And I'm much the same. If you would have asked me 10 years ago about safety, it would not have been on my radar. But I think a lot of times people can relate to just the question of, do you feel happy or do you feel fulfilled? That might be something that we can connect to first. And now for me, I don't focus necessarily on happiness. I focus on safety. Because if I feel safe, then I feel more free and more resourced and more capable. When I think we feel unhappy or disconnected or unfulfilled, we also don't feel like we have agency. We feel helpless. We're in victimhood, right? We're in survival. So to me, maybe the question begins with, do I feel happy? Do I like who I am? Do I like how I show up? Do I have one person in my life, professional, personal, that I feel like I can be myself with? I know everything changed for me when I had one safe person in my life that I felt completely unfiltered with, that I didn't have to hide anything. That one safe person moved the needle. It changed everything. That's where I got to internalize, like, oh, this is what safety actually feels like. I do think we need a relationship component to really dive into safety. And I don't just mean that romantically, but I do think we have to be in relation with someone who is safe for us to really start to internalize what that feels like.
And that could be a romantic partner, that could be a family member, a friend, a coworker. You could certainly reflect on all of those departments and see who comes to mind. I also will add that it could be with a pet. And sometimes some people don't feel like they do have an actual human that would fit this definition. And so pets unconditionally love us. So maybe that's a starting place.
Yeah. And pets are really regulating. Like being able to be next to like a warm body and their steady heartbeat, like all of those things help us co-regulate.
And obviously that's not the end goal, but if you need an entry point, starting with a pet or an animal or, something that feels a little bit less daunting could be it.
Yeah, I agree. I'm so glad you said that. Pets have been a huge part of my life. I've always had a dog and it's the best.
I truly believe that we do not deserve them.
My dog looks at me and I'm like, oh, I do not deserve this unconditional love. It is 3 hours past your dinner time.
Totally, but they're so forgiving.
They are. We can learn a lot from them.
Yeah. I don't know if you can see mine. She's on our YouTube channel. People will be able to see her, but she's just laying on the pillow.
Just curled back there. So cute.
All right. We are now conceptualizing anxiety as not just anxiety, but it's fueled by potentially shame, rage, grief. So what is, you obviously coach, you do this life work. This is your bread and butter. So obviously anyone who's interested in maybe starting this work could certainly reach out to you and receive professional expertise. And working with any mental health professional is a great start. But what are tools that someone could use by themselves immediately after they end this fabulous episode?
Yeah. Well, again, I would come back to movement and having a movement practice. And what I want to add to that, it's not about just, going on a run. What it's about is checking in with yourself first. Like, what is my energy like today? Am I feeling really anxious and really heightened? Okay, it would be really beneficial and it would match my nervous system if I did something a little higher intensity. Or like, wow, I'm feeling really down, depressed, heavy today. That wouldn't make sense to go push yourself in an intense workout. We have to match where you're at. So if my energy is low, I'm going to start with something slow and gentle to just invite a little bit of movement and life into my body. Whereas on the other one, we're going to invite a little bit of down regulation into the body by expelling some energy. So when we use movement and connect with our body, I think it's really important we check in with our energy first. Like, where am I at today? So now there's like an intention around it. It's not just, I'm supposed to go on a run to feel better, so I'm going on a run. We want to get out of that, like, supposed to. So that would be one of my greatest, most simplest tools that I think is so helpful when dealing with the nervous system. And then another tool that I love is meditations and visualizations. And I know we didn't really touch too much on IFS and parts today, but it's a really beautiful meditation to go internal and discover what different parts of you are present that day. We have so many different parts of us that have their own mind, their own body, their own belief systems, and it will benefit everyone to get to know all these different parts of themselves. That to me has been one of the most healing modalities I used in my own journey, was really being able to get to know myself in parts.
Yes, IFS is phenomenal. It is. And if anyone's like, what the heck is IFS? I highly recommend looking into it and doing your own work. We actually have an episode on IFS too, so you could certainly tune in to that episode as well. And then was there a third? Did I cut you off?
I think those were it. Those two, whether it's through visualization and meditation or through movement, I think those are really powerful practices. And one of them, it's like we're in movement, and one of them we're in stillness. And I want to make sure we kind of hit both ends of that, because we won't really always have the capacity to go move our bodies. So we might need a stillness practice. And some days we can't freaking sit still. So we better have something that involves movement.
Yes, that's a beautiful point. I would also say with the movement is we have a lot of moral tags that we attach to movement. So like running and something high energy, HIIT workout, heavy weightlifting, that's good. But just going for a walk, that's lazy. I would invite people to look at really viewing different types of movement in a more neutral way. That when you're in potentially hypoarousal or that heavy, deadened, disconnected, numb state, like you said, Erika, starting slow is what's necessary in that moment. That's what's going to be the most productive and the most beneficial, and not judging small movement, whether that's a walk around the block or stretching or yoga or anything that just feels a little bit more low energy. That's okay.
And just following that trend that you're bringing up too, like movement and exercise gets to feel good. Like it doesn't have to be a forceful thing or a punishment. It gets to actually just feel good. So if what feels good is a 5-minute walk, if what feels good is laying on a yoga mat in Shavasana, that's what feels good. Like it gets to actually be also a pleasure practice, which is a whole other topic. But I think that's really important in our healing as well.
Yeah. And allowing and giving yourself permission that whatever that is in that moment, it is okay and it is beautiful and it is needed. And the commentary of, well, I should have just ran or I should have gone to that CrossFit workout. No, you shouldn't have. Because your body will tell you what it needs.
Yeah. And then we get to bring in, oh, what part of me is saying that? I wonder why that part of me feels that way. Tell me more. And so we got to bring in that curiosity when we pair it with the part work, which I think is a game changer.
Yeah. Anything else before we wrap up? Any other additional tips or tricks?
Gosh, there's so many. I think what's really helpful when you're starting to get to know your body and your nervous system is to really learn about the different survival states. If we have a little bit of kind of psychoeducation on that, it can be really helpful. So knowing about fight, flight, and freeze and your safety state and being able to just start mapping, like, what does it look like when I'm in each of these states? Like, what is my behavior like? What emotions am I in? What triggers me here? The more that we can understand each of our nervous system states, I think that helps us know, what is it that I need? I know for me, the more I learned about polyvagal and the nervous system, that helped me with shame. Because if I was zoned out or flatlined, that inner critic would come in and say, you're so lazy, you're so this, you should be doing that. But if I could look at it and be like, wow, I'm in like a freeze state right now, that helped me move from what's wrong with me to what do I need? And that's like the most powerful question I think we can ask is what do I need? So knowing what state you're in, I think allows for more compassion and less shame.
Yes. And whatever the answer is, honoring it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Erika, thank you so, so much for joining me. This conversation was beautiful and deep and powerful and really meaningful to me because I think it's a nice reminder of being a little bit more in tune with what's happening internally. And if you feel like this episode resonates or you feel that others could benefit, please share it with others. We're so grateful for that, as well as give us a review. You can do that on Apple. You can do that on Spotify. It helps others discover Shit Talking Shrinks in a way where it invites people in to learn. So thank you all, and we'll catch you later.